In the summer of 1945, as the world burned in the final throes of history's most catastrophic war, a handful of men in Washington and Los Alamos were searching for an island. Not just any island, but one that could serve as the launching pad for a weapon so terrible, so absolute in its power, that it might bring the slaughter to an end. They needed a place close enough to Japan to reach its cities, yet distant enough to remain beyond the enemy's grasp. They needed flat land for the longest runways ever constructed, deep harbors for the largest ships, and enough space to house thousands of men and machines in absolute secrecy. What they found was a speck of coral and limestone in the western Pacific, a place that had changed hands between empires for centuries, a place most Americans had never heard of and would only learn about in whispers. They found Tinian. The island was small, barely 12 miles long and 5 miles wide, a fragment of volcanic rock thrust up from the Philippine Sea and crowned with vegetation that had watched empires rise and fall. For centuries it had belonged to Spain, a distant possession in their vast Pacific domain, where Spanish galleons once stopped for water and provisions on their long voyages between Acapulco and Manila. Then came the Germans after the Spanish-American War, claiming the Marianas as part of their colonial ambitions, though their tenure was brief and left little mark. When the First World War ended, the League of Nations mandated these islands to Japan, and it was the Japanese who truly transformed Tinian, bringing sugarcane plantations, a railroad, thousands of colonists, and the infrastructure of civilization to what had been a sleepy backwater. By 1944, some 15,000 Japanese civilians called Tinian home, alongside the military garrison that fortified its shores against the coming storm. That storm arrived in the summer of 1944, when American forces, having clawed their way across the Pacific in a campaign of unimaginable savagery, turned their eyes toward the Marianas. Saipan fell first, after weeks of brutal fighting that saw Japanese soldiers and civilians alike choose death over surrender, flinging themselves from cliffs into the sea rather than accept defeat. Then came Tinian's turn. On the 24th of July, Marines of the 4th and 2nd Divisions stormed ashore on the island's northwestern beaches, moving with the precision born of hard experience. The Japanese defenders fought with the desperate courage of men who knew they would not leave the island alive, turning every cave and canebrake into a fortress, but the outcome was never in doubt. By the 1st of August, after 9 days of fighting that claimed nearly 9,000 Japanese lives and 400 American ones, Tinian belonged to the United States. The sugarcane fields were blackened, the villages shattered, and the survivors, both military and civilian, were gone, dead or captured. What remained was an empty stage awaiting its most terrible performance. Within days of the island's capture, before the last shots had even echoed away, the Seabees arrived. These were the U.S. Navy's construction battalions, men who could build anything anywhere, and they set to work with a fervor that bordered on the fanatical. They had orders to transform Tinian into the largest airbase in the world, and they pursued that goal with bulldozers and explosives, cement mixers and steel, working around the clock under the merciless Pacific sun. They leveled hills, filled valleys, and paved over the remnants of Japanese civilization. They constructed 6 runways, each nearly 2 miles long and broad enough to handle the massive B-29 superfortresses that would soon arrive by the hundreds. They built roads and laid them out in a grid pattern that reminded homesick Americans of Manhattan, naming the streets Broadway, 8th Avenue, 42nd Street, a surreal transplantation of New York onto a tropical island 8,000 miles from home. They erected Quonset huts and mess halls, fuel depots and ammunition bunkers, workshops and hospitals. They dredged harbors and built piers that could handle the largest cargo vessels. In a matter of months, they created a city of war, a vast machine whose sole purpose was to rain destruction on Japan. By the spring of 1945, Tinian had become the busiest airfield on Earth. Hundreds of B-29s lined the runways, their aluminum skins gleaming under the sun, their bellies loaded with incendiaries and high explosives. Every night, wave after wave of these massive bombers roared into the darkness, bound for Japanese cities that would be transformed into infernos before dawn. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, one by one, Japan's urban centers were consumed by fire, the wooden houses packed tight in their ancient neighborhoods becoming kindling for firestorms that killed tens of thousands in single nights. The crews who flew these missions returned exhausted, traumatized by what they had seen and done. But still they flew again the next night, and the night after that, because the war demanded it and no one knew how else to make it end. Yet even as this conventional campaign of destruction reached its crescendo, another group was preparing for something entirely different. In September 1944, long before Tinian's runways were even finished, a special unit had been activated at Wendover Army Airfield in the remote desert of Utah. They called it the 509th Composite Group, and from the beginning it was shrouded in mystery. Its commander, Colonel Paul Tibbets, was a veteran pilot with an impeccable record, but even he had only the barest understanding of what his unit was training to do. The men were told they would deliver a special weapon, one that required unique handling, but they were told nothing about what that weapon was or what it would do. They practiced flying at high altitude, learned to execute sharp diving turns immediately after bomb release, rehearsed their navigation until they could find a single city block from 30,000 feet. They dropped dummy bombs shaped like enormous trash cans, watched them fall into the desert, and wondered what sort of explosive could possibly require such a massive casing. Security around them was absolute. They were forbidden from discussing their training with anyone, even each other beyond what was necessary. Letters home were censored. Visitors were prohibited. They existed in a bubble of secrecy within the larger war, and they had no idea why. In December 1944, the 509th moved to Tinian, taking up residence on the island's north field, slightly separated from the main bomber groups. Their silver B-29s, specially modified in ways the mechanics couldn't quite understand, stood apart on the hardstands. The other bomber crews regarded them with suspicion and resentment. Here were these Johnny-come-latelys who flew no missions, dropped no bombs, lost no men, yet seemed to enjoy special privileges and answer to no one. The tension simmered, occasionally boiling over into fistfights in the officers' club. But the men of the 509th kept their secrets and continued their mysterious training, flying practice missions over Japanese-held islands, dropping their dummy bombs and perfecting their technique. What they didn't know, what almost no one on Tinian knew, was that beneath the island's coral surface, in specially constructed air-conditioned buildings guarded day and night, scientists and technicians were assembling the two most expensive and complex devices ever created by human hands. The Manhattan Project, that vast secret program that had consumed billions of dollars and employed hundreds of thousands of people across the United States, had finally borne fruit. In the New Mexico desert on the 16th of July, 1945, the first atomic bomb had been detonated, unleashing a force equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT, creating a light bright enough to blind, a heat intense enough to melt sand into glass, and a mushroom cloud that punched into the stratosphere. The scientists who witnessed it were both exhilarated and horrified, knowing they had crossed a threshold from which humanity could never return. Now, working in the sweltering heat of their Tinian workshops under the codename Project Alberta, they were preparing two operational weapons for use against Japan. But first, they needed the materials. The uranium-235 that would form the core of the little boy bomb existed in only minute quantities, painfully extracted through an industrial process of staggering complexity. Every ounce was precious, irreplaceable, worth more than its weight in diamonds. The projectile and target assemblies had been fabricated to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The firing mechanism, the fusing systems, the arming devices, all of it was unique, untested in combat, and absolutely critical to the weapon's function. This cargo was too valuable to trust to air transport, which could crash, and too urgent to send by regular convoy, which could take weeks. So the Navy selected a ship for a special mission, one that could make the crossing to Tinian with maximum speed and minimum risk. They chose the USS Indianapolis. She was a beautiful ship, a Portland-class heavy cruiser launched in 1931, a vessel that embodied the Navy's interwar optimism and faith in the future. Her 9 8-inch guns could hurl shells the weight of a man over 15 miles with deadly accuracy. Her armored belt was 6 inches thick. Her turbines could push her through the sea at nearly 33 knots. And she carried a crew of 1,200 men who knew every rivet and plate of her hull. She had served with distinction throughout the war, earning 10 battle stars for actions across the Pacific, supporting the landings at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, bombarding Japanese shore installations, fighting off kamikaze attacks. On the 31st of March, 1945, during the Okinawa campaign, A kamikaze had managed to dive through her defensive fire and crash into her stern, tearing a hole in her hull, flooding compartments, killing 9 men and wounding 20. She had limped to Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California for repairs, arriving in late March with her crew wondering if they would see action again before the war ended. The repairs were still underway in mid-July when new orders arrived, classified at the highest level, directing the Indianapolis to prepare for immediate departure on a mission of utmost urgency. No details were provided. Captain Charles McVay III, the ship's commanding officer, was summoned to meetings with admirals and shadowy civilians who spoke in careful euphemisms. All he was told was that his ship would carry cargo of extraordinary importance, that speed was essential, and that the mission was so secret that even he would not be informed of the complete details. On the 15th of July, while workers were still welding the last plates into place, a convoy of trucks arrived at the dock escorted by armed guards. Men in civilian clothes supervised the loading of wooden crates and a massive lead cylinder, 15 feet long and 2 feet in diameter, so heavy it required a special hoist to swing it aboard. The sailors watched, curious and confused, as this mysterious cargo was secured in the cruiser's hangar, normally used to house float planes. Marines with loaded rifles took up positions around it. No one was allowed near. No one would answer questions. The crew began to speculate, was it gold, diamonds, the crown jewels? The truth never occurred to them. At dawn on the 16th of July, 1945, the same day the first atomic bomb was tested in New Mexico, the Indianapolis slipped her moorings and headed out through the Golden Gate, bound for Tinian. Captain McVay had been ordered to make the crossing in record time, and he pushed his ship hard, zigzagging through the swells at flank speed, driving westward across a Pacific that seemed empty and vast under summer skies. The crew fell into the rhythm of a fast passage, watch standing, maintenance, meals, sleep, watch standing again. They passed Honolulu without stopping, refueled at Eniwetok on the 20th, and continued without pause, the ship's wake stretching white and straight behind them as the distance scrolled away. They covered 5,000 miles in 10 days, an average speed of nearly 26 knots, one of the fastest trans-Pacific crossings of the war. On the 26th of July, the Indianapolis steamed into Tinian's harbor, her mysterious cargo intact, her mission accomplished. The unloading happened with the same secrecy that had attended the loading. The lead cylinder and the crates were swiftly transferred to trucks and driven to the assembly buildings at North Field, where scientists in sweat-stained shirts greeted their arrival with visible relief. With this shipment, they now possessed everything they needed. The uranium projectile would be inserted into Little Boy's gun barrel. The target assembly would be placed at the other end. The firing mechanism would slam one into the other at the moment of detonation, creating a supercritical mass that would unleash the fury of the atom. Within days, the bomb would be complete, loaded into the modified B-29 that Colonel Tibbets had personally named after his mother, and flown toward a Japanese city that would be erased from existence. But the Indianapolis and her crew knew none of this. Their orders were to proceed to Guam, then on to Leyte in the Philippines, where they would join Task Force 95 and resume normal operations. On the 28th of July, the cruiser departed Tinian, sailing alone and unescorted through waters that were supposed to be safe but never truly were. Captain McVay had requested a destroyer escort, standard procedure for capital ships moving through forward areas, but his request had been denied. Intelligence reports suggested the route was clear, submarine activity was low, and escorts were needed elsewhere. So the Indianapolis sailed alone, making her way south through the darkness of the Philippine Sea, her radar sweeping the empty ocean, her crew relaxing after the tension of their secret mission, many of them writing letters home or playing cards in the mess, thinking of the war's end which everyone knew must come soon. Midnight approached on the 30th of July, 1945. The sea was calm, the moon had risen, and visibility was good enough that the cruiser had been ordered to stop zigzagging, which slowed progress and burned fuel. She steamed straight and steady through the darkness at 17 knots, her silhouette sharp against the moonlit water. On the bridge, Captain McVay retired to his cabin, leaving instructions to be called if anything unusual was sighted. Below decks, men slept in their bunks, swaying gently with the ship's motion. In the engine rooms, the turbines hummed their eternal song. On the fantail, A few sailors smoked and talked quietly, watching the phosphorescence trail in the ship's wake. Everything was routine, everything was normal, everything was fine. 12 miles away, Commander Makitsura Hashimoto, captain of the Japanese submarine I-58, was bringing his boat to the surface after a day spent submerged. The I-58 was a large fleet submarine, one of the few still operational after 4 years of savage submarine warfare that had decimated the Japanese undersea fleet. Hashimoto had been patrolling these waters for weeks, finding nothing, burning through his fuel and supplies, growing increasingly frustrated as the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion. His crew was exhausted, the air inside the submarine was foul, and he was contemplating returning to base when his periscope officer called out a contact. There, silhouetted against the moon, was the unmistakable shape of a warship, moving fast and straight, apparently oblivious to danger. Hashimoto couldn't believe his luck. He maneuvered his submarine into position, waited until the range closed to less than a mile, and gave the order to fire. 6 Type 95 torpedoes leaped from the I-58's tubes, their electric motors driving them through the dark water at 46 knots, their warheads armed and ready. The first torpedo struck the Indianapolis on her starboard bow at 12 minutes past midnight. The explosion was catastrophic, a column of water and fire that rose hundreds of feet into the air, tearing away the ship's bow and sending tons of steel spinning into the night. 13 seconds later, the second torpedo hit amidships, just beneath the bridge, the blast tearing through fuel tanks and magazines, igniting fires that turned the night orange. The ship lurched violently, throwing men from their bunks, shattering machinery, collapsing bulkheads. Power failed instantly. The emergency lighting flickered and died. In the sudden darkness, filled with smoke and steam and the screams of wounded men, the crew fought to understand what had happened and what they should do. Captain McVeigh was thrown from his bunk by the first explosion. He scrambled to the bridge in his skivvies, demanding reports, trying to assess the damage, but communications were gone and no one knew anything. The ship was listing heavily to starboard, already settling by the bow, and he could feel her dying beneath his feet. He tried to send a distress signal, but the radio room had been destroyed and the backup systems were underwater. He gave the order to abandon ship, but with the power out and the chaos complete, the order barely reached anyone. Men were already jumping, leaping from the tilting deck into an ocean that was slicked with oil and littered with debris. The lifeboats, secured by lines that no one could see in the darkness, were impossible to launch. The life rafts, some of them, broke free and drifted away. Men grabbed onto anything that floated, wooden planks, empty shell casings, clusters of floating netting, and kicked away from the ship as she rolled further and further, her screws rising out of the water, still turning slowly, her stern pointing at the stars. 12 minutes after the first torpedo struck, the USS Indianapolis slid beneath the waves. She went down bow first, her stern rising almost vertically, pausing for a moment as if reluctant to leave the world of light and air, then plunging into the depths with a roar of escaping air and collapsing metal. Hundreds of men were still aboard, trapped in flooded compartments or clinging to the hull, and they went down with her, pulled into the black depths by the suction of her sinking. Those who had made it off the ship found themselves alone in the vast ocean, their ship simply gone, swallowed by the darkness as if she had never existed. They called out to each other, forming small groups, trying to count survivors, trying to understand what had just happened. Roughly 800 men had escaped the ship. 300 had gone down with her. And the nightmare was only beginning. The first hours were almost peaceful. The men floated in their life jackets, coated in thick fuel oil that made them cough and vomit, but also helped insulate them against the water's chill. They sang songs to keep their spirits up, told jokes, reassured each other that rescue would come by morning. Surely the ship had gotten off a distress call. Surely someone had noticed their absence. Surely the Navy knew where they were. But morning came and no rescue appeared. The sun rose into a cloudless sky, beating down on them with merciless intensity, and they realized that no one was coming, that no one knew they were here. The Japanese submarine had long since departed. The Indianapolis had been scheduled to arrive at Leyte on the 31st of July, but when she failed to appear, no one thought to investigate. It was assumed she had been delayed, or diverted, or had changed course for operational reasons. No alarm was raised. The protocols that should have protected them had failed utterly and completely. The days blurred together in a fever dream of suffering. The men had no food and no water except the salt sea that surrounded them, which drove them mad with thirst even as it slowly killed them. They had no shade from the sun, which burned their oil-coated skin into raw blisters that wept and cracked and wouldn't heal. They had no way to stay together, and the current slowly scattered them across miles of ocean, breaking the larger groups into smaller ones, isolating the weak from the strong. Men began to die from their injuries, from exposure, from drinking seawater in their desperation, and their bodies drifted away or sank beneath the surface. Hallucinations tormented them. They saw the Indianapolis floating just below the water and tried to swim down to her, drowning in the attempt. They saw islands on the horizon that didn't exist, Japanese ships coming to capture them, submarines rising from the depths. They attacked each other in fits of paranoia, convinced their shipmates were enemy agents trying to steal their water. They gave up, simply letting go of their life jackets and slipping beneath the waves with expressions of peace on their faces. And then came the sharks. They had been there from the beginning, drawn by the vibrations of the sinking ship and the scent of blood in the water. But at first they had been cautious, circling at a distance, waiting. As the men weakened, as more bodies appeared in the water, the sharks grew bolder. They were oceanic whitetips, large and aggressive, and they began to attack. Men would scream and disappear, pulled under in an explosion of thrashing water and blood. Others would feel something brush against their legs and panic, kicking and flailing, attracting more sharks. The predators learned that the men in life jackets were easier prey than those in rafts, and they focused their attention on the largest groups, where the concentration of victims was highest. The survivors, already pushed to the edge of human endurance, now had to contend with the knowledge that something was hunting them in the water, that at any moment they might feel teeth close around their legs, that the ocean was not empty but filled with silent killers. They pulled their limbs up, tried to stay still, formed tight circles facing outward, but nothing helped. The sharks kept coming. On the morning of the 2nd of August, a Lockheed Ventura bomber on routine anti-submarine patrol flew over the area and spotted something in the water. The pilot, Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn, circled lower and saw what appeared to be debris and oil slick, then realized with horror that some of the debris was moving. These were men, dozens of them, scattered across the sea. He immediately radioed for help and dropped life rafts and supplies, though many of the survivors were too weak to reach them. Within hours, a flying boat had landed on the water and begun pulling men aboard, and ships were racing to the scene. The rescue continued through the night and into the next day, with crews working frantically to pluck survivors from the water before more of them died. But they were too late for most. When the count was finally tallied, only 316 men had been saved. Nearly 900 had perished, killed in the initial attack, drowned in the sinking, or lost to the sea in the days that followed. It was the greatest loss of life at sea in the history of the United States Navy, a tragedy of staggering proportions that had gone unnoticed for nearly 5 days. The survivors were taken to hospitals in Guam and the Philippines, their bodies wrecked by exposure and dehydration, their minds haunted by memories they would never escape. They were told to keep silent about what had happened, that the Indianapolis and her mission were still classified, that the details could not be disclosed. So they endured their recovery in enforced silence, unable to speak of their ordeal, unable to mourn their shipmates, unable to make sense of the horror they had lived through. Many of them would never fully recover, carrying the physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives, waking in the night to the memory of sharks circling in clear water, of friends slipping away into the depths, of days and nights when death seemed preferable to another moment of suffering. And then, just 4 days after the last survivor was pulled from the water, the world learned what the Indianapolis had carried. On the 6th of August, 1945, Colonel Paul Tibbets flew his B-29, the Enola Gay, from Tinian to Hiroshima, and at 8:15 in the morning, Little Boy fell away from the bomb bay and plunged toward the city below. 43 seconds later, at an altitude of 1,900 feet above the city center, the uranium projectile slammed into its target, creating a supercritical mass, and the atom split. In an instant, A light brighter than 1,000 suns illuminated the sky. A fireball hotter than the surface of the sun consumed everything within a mile, and a shockwave of unimaginable force flattened buildings and shattered windows for miles around. 70,000 people died instantly. The city simply ceased to exist, replaced by a burning wasteland beneath a mushroom cloud that rose 8 miles into the stratosphere. 3 days later, Fat Man fell on Nagasaki, and another city died. On the 15th of August, Emperor Hirohito addressed his people by radio for the first time in history, announcing Japan's surrender. The war was over. The men who had survived the Indianapolis learned of this while lying in their hospital beds, and the revelation was almost too much to comprehend. Their ship had carried the components for the bomb that ended the war. Their suffering, their sacrifice, the deaths of their 800 shipmates. All of it had meaning, had purpose, had accomplished something of world historical significance. They had been part of the most important military mission of the entire war, and they hadn't even known it. The secret they had unknowingly carried across the Pacific had changed everything, had brought the nightmare to an end, had saved countless lives that would have been lost in an invasion of Japan. But the knowledge brought no comfort, only a bitter awareness of the price that had been paid, of the men who had died not knowing that their mission had succeeded, that the cargo they guarded had fulfilled its purpose. In the vast calculus of war, in the balance sheet of lives saved and lives lost, perhaps it all made sense. But for the survivors floating in their beds, staring at the ceiling and remembering the taste of seawater and the feeling of something brushing against their legs in the darkness, the equations offered no solace. They had delivered the atom to Tinian, and the atom had ended the war, but the ocean had taken its payment in full, and the debt would never be forgotten.